Hello again and good afternoon. After the 2 days very hectic program of the Global Budapest Dialogue. First of all, I would like to thank you to invite us, the ORF and the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, to use the time very efficiently. We have a very important and distinguished speakers in our panel today, and I would like to start very fast. I would start with the Thomas. Thomas, I know that you are the historian, and in the first round, as a first question, I just want to ask you that how we can see the historical change regarding the conceptualization of sovereignty and the border in general sense in the discussions over the history and the multidisciplinary approach in the international relations.
Thank you very much for asking me this question. I want to thank you also first for having been invited to this conference, which I greatly enjoy. And well, as Shrey said, I think it's very important before you start a discussion that you define terms. And I'm sure everybody here in this room has maybe his or her own understanding of what globalization means. I don't think there is any such thing as de-globalization. I think globalizing phenomena and tendencies, by which I essentially mean interconnectedness, becoming connected, existed since the dawn of mankind, so to speak. It's not a continuous process, but it comes in phases. It's not always everywhere and in every realm of life. Sometimes it's here and there, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. In a sense, the first act of globalization was when Homo sapiens migrated to every inhabitable place in the world. If that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be talking about this in the first place. Think about the empire building of, say, the Romans in Europe that brought together and integrated formerly very distinct regions and cultures. Same things happened in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas. The old world became interconnected through trade routes, Silk Road, slave trade routes, or disease, like the Black Death. And even there we have empire building, for example, in the case of the Mongols and their successor empires. The European explorations then in the early modern period connected this old world with the new world. And again, we have an exchange of ideas, goods, peoples, diseases, etc. And we could continue this to this very day. During all these times, borders have existed as well, sometimes more pronounced, sometimes less. And parallel to these two phenomena, globalization and borders, occurred a third development, namely that all of mankind acquired and keeps acquiring an ever higher living standard and greater prosperity. And this tells me that the existence of borders does not, historically seen, prevent whatever positive effect globalization may or may not have on the well-being of man. So I don't really see a direct correlation between globalization and fragmentation. I don't think it's the case that if globalization rises, then fragmentation decreases by the same proportion and vice versa. If I may add some other aspect too, that I really think also that the history of mankind is characterized by an ongoing homogenization process. That is a step-by-step process on an ever more encompassing regional level. What do I mean by this? It all started with nomadic tribes and clans. They were truly independent. They had their own rules and absolute independence. Once man settles down and builds a village and starts agriculture, everybody who lives in that village has to obey these rules. The next step would be a larger village, or maybe even city, maybe even a city-state. The next step would be what in Europe we call the nation-state. And now we have greater regions, I would call them greater regions, maybe you could also call them super-states of the multipolar world, like the US, China, India, the EU, which hasn't made that step yet, and Russia. Former Soviet Union would be also a great example. And whenever this regional homogenization happened, we had the same procedures. We have an exchange of ideas, we have the establishment of common laws and institutions, we have a homogenization of language and culture, and the facilitation of trade. Old rights were abrogated, sovereignty was given up, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not, and old traditions were superseded and or destroyed. So I don't know where this is going. My guess would be this is probably it. Yeah? I'm not so sure if this one village idea is realistic, but I think I'll stop here now and return the word to Shui.
Thank you, Thomas. I got some notes related with especially your quote. There is a direct correlation between globalization and fragmentation. I think it would be an interesting input for the second round. I will give the floor to Matthias. Matthias, as I mentioned that in the first round, I would like to take your point of view as an economist at the same time, how you see the economic component of the globalization and how it's affected debates over the border and the sovereignty in this age.
Okay, the topic we are going to address in this particular panel, it's a very broad topic, borders. And there are, of course, many voices popping up in my mind about the importance of borders, the relevance, where borders are becoming increasingly less relevant, and where we shouldn't have borders in the first place. Now, I think physical borders, they are important primarily for two reasons. To control migration for the sake of maintaining public order. Some would go so far and call it national security. And to control migration into social welfare systems or social security systems, whereby here the overarching policy objective would be justice. But when we talk about commercial globalization, it is not so much physical borders that are relevant here, it is much more regulatory borders. Regulatory borders that are operated and actually well maintained by national governments in Europe. It's also EU institutions on top of national governments, and very often for the sake of protecting well-organized domestic interests or domestic industries, when you look at it from an economics or political economy point of view. And very often, regulatory borders are not about sovereignty. They are about maintaining bureaucracy. The European Union is a prime example we can get back to in a minute. But generally, regulatory borders are often defended as part of a larger discourse in the political domain, which is about economic nationalism. And this debate about sovereignty and economic nationalism, it unfortunately, from my point of view, still resonates very well. It has always resonated very well amongst the general public and the political class. And this is still true irrespective of whether we are talking about democracies here in Europe or more authoritarian regimes across the world. I would leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you, Matthias. I think you touched upon the last part, is the tariff regimes and economic nationalism. It's that has been debated in the last 2 days in here as well, and it turns to be more interesting. Right now, I would like to turn to Daniela. He already mentioned about to control borders and these kind of the important concepts that Matthias mentioned. I just want to ask you that for the first round, how you see the issue of sovereignty within the European Union since the integration has been discussed?
Well, you know, one of the founding principles on which the European integration was started and carried on was, and still is, subsidiarity. It was implicit in the first agreements. It has been enshrined in the treaties since the Maastricht Treaty, and according to subsidiarity, decisions should be made at the lowest level possible, with the higher powers intervening only when the local powers cannot achieve the objective in an effective way. Now, from my point of view, the European Union is clearly overreaching and betraying these principles, not just in border policies, but more broadly speaking, we can consider, just to name a few, the Green Deal, which is a sort of 5-year plan, possibly even more suicidal than the Soviet ones. You can mention the GDPR, which is crushing the innovative startups in the continent. You can mention the fact that we have something like 25,000 EU laws and regulations currently in force. The weaponization of the rule of law by part of the European Commission against Poland in the past, currently still against Hungary, just because those governments doesn't align, the Hungarian governments doesn't align to, the political wishes of the majority, or the political majority in the Commission and the Parliament. There are now proposals for further change in the treaty. Mr. Vlaniewski mentioned them this morning about further centralization, so really forging a sort of superstate of Europe. Now, when the Constitution was rejected by the popular vote, the European establishment actually had the option to just, pull the brakes and abandon the federalization project. Instead, they chose to double down, and they are now trying to forge a state without a constitution. But how do we call a state without a constitution?
Thank you, Daniele. It's an interesting point you touched upon. I think we will have a more deep discussion with you in the second round. For the first round, I give the last floor to Egosa. Egosa, as we witnessed that we have been discussing a little bit more Western style of the globalization and debate until how can you see that the different conceptualization from the different cultures and the different part of the world see the borders, sovereignty and the globalization?
Well, thank you very much. First, everyone talks about weaponization, and it's helpful to think of borders as weapons. It's when you see borders as weapons that you begin to understand the kinds of dynamics and the shifting geopolitical realities that come with borders. But I think it's important to first underscore that borders now mean things that are socially constructed and far beyond the physicality of territories, which are an integral part of the definition of the state. Sovereignty, of course, relates to the ability of a state to effectively govern its territory, and that is what we all know. But think of it. Today, globalization has meant trans-territoriality. And in that process, we see the opening of borders as an instrumentality of globalization, whereas the closing of borders then becomes an instrument of deglobalization. And it's in that sense that you think of borders as instruments. So when Clausewitz talked about war being the continuation of politics by other means, borders would also be part of the instrument of that continuation of war by other means. Now, think of it. Today, it is possible to have missiles and military weapons and technologies that have very little bearing on physical and territorial boundaries. So countries get violated, in the cyberspace, so the notion of the spaces that we refer to essentially in the physical and territorial conception of boundaries and borders must now be completely reviewed. So globalization has meant that there is transnationality, transterritoriality in terms of the movements of goods and services and persons and ideas. Technology has meant that we can actually do without borders. We can minimize those borders. And yet, there's a sense in which, from the discussion we've had already, borders continue to be fixated on the idea of keeping others out. And what has driven this continued, conception, even though it is now no longer in tune with the imperatives of a globalizing world? First is that there is now an intensification of conflicts over very scarce resources. We've talked about critical minerals, for instance. We've talked about even the ability of the state to meet its obligations to its citizens. And therefore, every state is now more conscious of the need to protect and defend what it has, as opposed to shared prosperity that open borders would have meant.
Thank you, Egosa. For starting with the second round, I want to change the order. And I would like to ask the second question again to Egosa, because I think it would be interesting to hear more specific examples, basically from the African continent, that we know that we basically seeing or observing an interesting post-colonial nation-building process in the different African countries, as well as Nigeria as well. How do you see the future, the interpretation of the debate over the local, global, even the glocal? We have the new conceptions like this. How do you see the African continent, the future interpretation regarding these, the border issues and the sovereignty perception?
I think in Africa, the notion of borders is one that is communally understood. You know, that Africa has been trans-territorial across the ages, and that's its history, that's its cultural experience. But then came colonization, and colonization simply imposed artificial boundaries. You know, in Africa, these are, artificial boundaries to the extent that, they just simply had to do with drawings that were made at the Berlin Conference in 1884, where Africa was partitioned and divided without any consideration of pre-existing, lines of demarcation. So to the extent that those boundaries are artificial, Africa has had, a robust engagement with borders, beginning from when the then Organization of African Unity decided that those boundaries should be retained. Now, so the African conception of, boundaries is simply one that is symbolic, but does not stop the trans-territoriality that has been historically endemic to the African understanding. And you would see that when Africans deal with borders, they do so in terms of the shared humanity and shared commonality, and the fact that every border that opens offers an opportunity for reciprocity in terms of contributions from this side and the other side. Africa has not had to defend and protect territories in that militarist sense. There is no securitization of the African architecture of boundary building, of borders. It is simply something that is symbolic and ought to encourage people to create partnerships that would enable, the world become a much better place the way Africans have always thought.
Thank you very much for that, the positive spirit that comes from the African, what they learned from their own experience. I think it will be much more better in upcoming days when the world goes through in a chaotic days. We can continue with Daniela. Daniela, you have lots of works on the migration issue, and also Matthias mentioned about the role of borders to control the migration. How do you see the next 10 years? Because the United Nations clearly say that there is a projection seems to be not very optimistic to increasing number of the refugees and the migration across the globe. How do you see the role of the borders when we are talking about the eroding of the real borders, at the same time the understanding of the borders by the European Union? How do you see the migration issue will come to the hands of the EU values and EU general as well?
Well, let me start with a few numbers. The share of the European population on, the total human population in 1900 was about 30%. Then it went down in 1950, it was about 23%, and then fell off to currently is like 9%. And in 1900, we literally just had millions of Europeans emigrating outside the continent, whereas in the current 9%, we have a lot of foreign-born people or people whose family has relatively recently arrived in the continent. So we could safely state that Europeans are a shrinking minority in the world. We have plenty of projections about the fact that many native European peoples in Western Europe are bound to become minority in their own country by the end of this century. One was mentioned yesterday during the late evening debate, the one about the fact that white British are projected to become a minority in the UK by 2066. But we have similar projections for virtually every Western European countries. As the Machiavelli Center, we have realized one a few years ago for Italy as well. We are just a bit more lucky than the British, but because we expect to hold up more or less until the end of the century, but this is the trend for all the Western European countries. So strong borders are needed in Europe in order to preserve European peoples, European cultures, and also, why not, human diversity? Because we all know that diversity is our strength. So it's a good objective to be followed. And I would just add in a few minutes why, in my opinion, the EU borders are currently failing. There are a few explanations. One is that we are following international norms that are clearly outdated. They were done in a historical period in which there weren't, and it was unthinkable to have millions of people undertaking journey across continents, like it's the case nowadays. They were written having in mind maybe a few thousand political dissidents coming mostly from European countries. So they are ill-equipped to handle the current flows, both because of the scale, because of also the mixed nature. We have a few refugees among masses of economic migrants. For example, in the European Union, last year, we had like 1 million of requests for application for asylum. And even if the European Union is granting very generously, not just the refugee status, which is codified by the international norms, but also some other forms of protection, humanitarian, subsidiary protections. Even with that, less than 50% of the applicants actually were recognized, granted some form of protection. Those receiving the refugee status were less than 20%. So that's meaning that a vast majority of economic migrants are actually exploiting norms that were written and that are made to help refugees. Moreover, the EU focus has shifted from the law enforcement on the border towards the true or perceived rights of migrants. If you look to the Schengen Agreement, the regional Schengen Agreement, you will see a lot of space in it was devoted on the better way to ensure that no illegal crossings is going to happen in the new common border, whereas now the vast majority of EU laws and regulations on migrations are for helping migrants to actually reach our countries. You have over-regulations that are quite common when the EU is involved. These over-regulations is clearly slowing down the law enforcement on the border. And because of all these factors, we are witnessing a very, I would say, bizarre situations, which is showing the true hypocrisy of this EU establishment. Because now the EU liberal establishment is fundamentally externalized the border control to transit countries. And this specifically because those transit countries are not bound to follow our rules. This makes no sense. If you think that those rules are fair because they are necessary to defend the human rights of people, then you should uphold them. But if they are not about rights, if they are about, let's say, entitlements, so you should change those norms, not just tell someone else to block the migrants. One last thing, we also have a lot of actors and powers inside the European Union who are actively working in order to avoid that the states manage to actively and effectively control the borders. You know, we have these NGO with their ships, which obviously unwillingly, but are de facto helping the smugglers. We have some sectors, militant sectors of the judiciary that are sabotaging our governments. We know very well in Italy, we have this very well-known case of Matteo Salvini, who some years ago, as an interior minister, he forbidden some illegals to just disembark on our shores. He didn't detain them in any way. He just told them, you can go anywhere in the world, just not in Italy. He was indicted, put under trial with the bizarre accusation of kidnapping, and only very recently he get acquitted. So those are tough problems, tough issues that we have to solve in order to have an effective border control in the European Union.
Thank you, Daniela, for that comprehensive approach, especially regarding the exploiting the EU values perception. It's a different way of the approach to consider the issue. Thomas, you mentioned about as I said, there is a clear correlation between globalization and the fragmentation. Daniela gives lots of important examples from the Italy. I would like to ask also the Austrian example of the strong border understanding. Actually, what does it mean and what it stands for, the Austria sovereignty and the border?
Yes, thank you for that question. First of all, I would like to emphasize what Matthias said also, that what I then didn't say, but I think it was clear, borders do not just not prevent globalization, we need borders. Because globalization can be perceived positively and negatively, and we need borders to ideally prevent the bad consequences and ideally not be in the way of the good consequences. Mass migration, I mean, Daniela has basically pretty much said everything, is per se not a good or bad thing, but the way it's currently performed in Europe, it is considered a threat, and the Europeans definitely have to do something about it. And Austria doesn't really have its own concept. They're simply referring to the EU, and Daniela already mentioned that. It's this pact on migration and asylum that is supposed to be enforced in 2026. Well, apart from the flaws, I only believe that when I see it. But Shui, I would like to use that opportunity to, as you suggested, also talk again about my understanding of borders and the subtle differences that are there that are not necessarily obvious in the first place. Let's take Austria and migration as an example. I mean, so officially we have a state border. At the same time, Austria allows officially mass migration, which is also welcomed by certain stakeholders, but not by the majority, but it's happening. So despite the existence of a border, we are open, both in terms of the permeability of that border and in terms of our mindset. At the same time, the migrants that come, most of them, have a closed mindset and are creating a parallel culture with an invisible border inside Austria. And this invisible border is much more dangerous and powerful than any other border that we have. And this is where Huntington comes in. Borders between civilizations are not visible. They are there and they're very hard to overcome. And the tricky thing in Europe is that we now already have civilizational borders within our own civilization. And it's not just the foreigners. If you look at the EU, for example, I always like to make that example, and I could ask you all now, do you know the most favorite TV star in your neighboring country? Why don't? We don't know that. Despite the integration that is happening on so many levels, there are still so many invisible walls, of course, which are much harder to overcome than something like tariffs, which are regulatory and not visible in that sense. But still, I think it's really a matter of efficiency of measures in terms of cooperation across borders. If you want to deal with global problems, question of will maybe, which is absent in Europe in many cases, and we had so many examples here during this conference already. But with this Nietzschean thought, I'll just leave it for now.
Thank you, Thomas. Matthias, in one of your works, you use the concept of the technology sovereignty. And in this case, I just want to ask actually two separate questions, but to understand the relations between how do you conceptualize the technology sovereignty while we are talking about the invisible walls in the global age? And can you also a little bit tell about in your first round speech mentioned about the tariff regimes and basically the economic nationalism? So how do you see these three of them will shape the next years in terms of the real borders and the sovereignty?
Okay, it's difficult to say what we are going to see in the future. Let me start with this political notion of technology sovereignty, sometimes referred to as economic sovereignty or strategic autonomy. It's been a political buzzword popping up in the EU at a time in which the EU faced, I would say, an institutional crisis after the Eurozone financial market and government debt crisis. You can see in trust service that trust in EU institutions went down. So the EU in a way had to reinvent itself, and one of the key pillars to base the EU's work on was strategic sovereignty, technology sovereignty, and autonomy. And it comes in different colors and different shapes. The concept is relatively vague, and depending on the policy areas that you look at, it can mean pretty much everything. It is a mix between political calls for command and control regulation, for desire on the side of ministries or governments to steer the outcomes of the economy at large, or at least the digital economy. But it has also some, I would say, well-grounded policy objectives like cyber security. As concerns economic nationalism, the debate in a way evolved towards what we have now, and this is the notion of resilience, or plainly speaking, to become less dependent on others, and to, in a way, give you some, an evolution of how this worked, but it's fictional. You can go back to George Washington, one of the great founding fathers, who once said that dependence on others is the worst vulnerability of all humanity, who was quoted by Abraham Lincoln, then quoted by Xi Jinping, who twisted it, saying, no, self-reliance is the path to strength. Xi Jinping, he argued that dependence on others is bad unless you depend on us. Donald Trump, of course, agreed. Joe Biden pedaled back, said, well, maybe we depend on each other a little. And then Ursula von der Leyen came in and said, well, in the EU, we call it strategic autonomy and technological sovereignty. The problem is that we are also having a debate about competitiveness in the EU, and a debate about what we can do with our single market, which, beyond zero tariffs and the principle of mutual recognition, does not really exist in the EU. Now, if you open up a Pandora's box with this continuing debate and narrative about strategic sovereignty, you also empower national member states to call for sovereignty themselves and to avoid harmonizing commercial legal code in the EU or guarding their turf as concerns regulatory powers for pretty much every policy, sector-specific policies, but also horizontal policies. In the EU, we still have 27 countries. We still have 27 different national regimes for labor market policy, tax policy, business code, contract law. Add to that differences in pharmaceutical regulation, financial market regulation, and all sorts of other regulations. And this is not going to disappear at any time soon under the current institutional setup of the EU. Now add to that 24 different languages, 27 different regulatory dialects, and you will realize that there's not much to gain with the single market and competitiveness. Now, if competitiveness remains the goal in EU economic and trade policy, then I think we need to embrace something that I would call competitive harmonization. which is basically about harmonizing as much as you can, not necessarily under the principle of anonymousness. Economic integration and legal integration in the EU, it has never worked with full agreement by all. It has always required leadership, which is why I would call for a coalition of willing countries to go ahead with. Maybe or may not in alignment with the principle of subsidiarity, that always remains seen, but you always need to have someone in charge of developing the rules, designing the rules, but also enforcing the rules. And this is true for traditional political domains, but like, security, controlling migration, but also for economic and trade policy. So my bottom line here is that if the real goal is competitiveness, I think if the EU wants to regain economic strength in relative terms to others, which are not waiting for us, then we need to become more like China or the United States. Not in the negative sense, not by bullying others or raising protectionist walls, but by creating a real single market in which businesses can easily scale from one country to another.
Wow, we have been discussing the economical, political, and the different perceptions of the borders, but I just want to make last round for just a few sentence question in a very, what I note that you have been saying. I have one provocative questions, last one. Do you think will physical walls turn to the invisible walls in soon when we are focusing on the reimagining the real borders while we are dealing with the global issues like the climate change, migration, pandemics? How do you see? I need just a few sentences.
Can I just very quickly say, that, it is true that countries have interests to protect, and for which reason they would go about control, defense, protection, and so on and so on. But I think there is an oversimplification, of the larger issues that relate to borders. For instance, from an African perspective, Africa has never closed its borders. Africa has been conquered. Africa has been, taken at will for its resources, for its people. And yet, Africa hasn't gone to the other side of the world to say, open your doors, because we don't have the capacity to conquer and to control. So I think that these are issues that are up for debate, and you have raised the critical things. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about technological advancements. All of these things that have the tendency and the overall consequence of increasing global inequalities and creating room for global injustices. These are critical issues in border control and management that I think we should address. There's no way you can close borders and pretend that we can collectively deal with issues of climate change, for instance, because climate change is transnational. It has nothing to do with how much you control your borders or how much you keep people out. So it's not simply about migration. Migration is important. Don't get us wrong at all. Migration is very important, but we must not isolate these issues. I think that a more holistic approach to discussing issues of borders is what we require at this time. There is a collective danger to all of us as human beings, whether we're in Europe or in North America or in Africa or in Asia or Latin America. And the more we divide, fragment, and close borders, the farther we would be from dealing with the issues that collectively threaten all of us.
Well, the fact that who's taking advantage of having no borders or weaker borders are always the stronger actors. Now, those could be large multinational corporations, could be, organized crimes, could be terrorist groups. It is also the peoples who are currently booming. So those who are the strongest in terms of demography. That's the case of many African people. The Nigerian people is the best, possibly the best case of that. Nigeria is booming with its population. So, it's easier to speak about the fact that we want to have cooperative borders, we shouldn't close too much ourselves in the specific moment in which we are taking advantage of it. Not with bad intentions, I'm not saying that. But the fact of it's those who are taking advantage of the fact that the borders are quite open. And another brief things that I would like to stress, and partially was mentioned also before by others, is that you cannot cancel completely a border. If you try to cancel a border outside a nation, you're just moving it inside your nation. And we are experimenting it very well in Europe, in many European cities, when we are now witnessing those type of borders in the core of our cities between ethnic districts. This is a big failure of any policy to actually manage mass migration. Probably because you cannot manage mass migration. You can manage migration by reducing its number. But I think I'm very skeptical of any way to effectively manage migration flows where the numbers are so large.
Yeah, I'm somewhat reluctant to make a final general statement about like hard borders versus invisible borders or soft borders. I mean, it's as I said, for me it's about the efficiency of the border. It doesn't matter whether it's visible or not, and whether it should be established or not. Again, depends on the issue that we're dealing with. And so that's what I said at my opening statement. This is a very ongoing, always changing, complex project. So I know it's somewhat of a weasel answer, but as a historian particularly, you should only talk about the things that already happened and not what's happening right now or is going to happen.
Okay, I would like to focus on regulatory borders which prevent voluntary transaction, which has largely nothing to do with the issue of migration. At the same time, I see that, and I think this is probably true for all of us here, we are somewhere between what's recently described in the book, globalists on the one hand and localists on the other. Most of us are hybrids. We love traveling, we love consuming foreign goods and services, we love to go to other countries for business. In fact, when you look at the numbers, it's clear the trend of commercial globalization, at the very least, trading goods and services, still increasing, travel services increasing, and even beyond economics and business, cross-border marriages are also increasing. And I think this trend is not going to stop. I think many individuals, if not most globally, have an innate tendency to globalize, to enjoy what's happening beyond your own border. Now, focusing on voluntary transactions and regulatory barriers, I can only repeat, if the overarching objective of the EU, and this is, I think, true for most EU member states, is to improve the competitiveness of our businesses, the capabilities of what our individuals can do to make a good living, I think we need to get rid of borders in the sense that we need to get rid of regulatory fragmentation that is doing nothing more than to create bureaucracy and duplication. I think most Europeans, they share common consumer protection preferences, not necessarily consumer tastes. So this is probably one field where policymakers can act. We don't need to have, as a company, another tax accountant or legal advisor as soon as we want to send our goods or services to another EU member state. I think in Europe we don't lack ambition, we don't lack capabilities, and we don't lack startup. But what is holding all of them back to prosper, especially compared to other jurisdictions like United States, emerging China, is that we still have too much regulatory fragmentation that is holding them back.
I would like to thank you all of you. It is one of the best panel I have been moderating. I learned a lot, seriously. I just want to add something as a final remarks. I think we are just the beginning of the discussions related with the sovereignty border for different cultures, different countries. But it will be interesting age that we have been both need to work on the how we can improve the globalization and its deficit, but at the same time how we can keep the national borders as much as possible, and it's not an easy balance, I would say. I have been working on the local leadership for a long time, and there are lots of the approaches in different fields that contribute to these debates in a different manner. Once more, I would like to take to ORF and the Hungarian Institute International Affairs and the great team of our panel. Thank you very much, and audience, thank you for listening.